Hello and welcome to our first set of notes on biochemistry. In this section, we're just going to start talking about molecules that are important for living organisms and the reactions that are used to make those molecules or break them. To start with, I want to talk about this word that you see here on the page, organic. A lot of you, I'm sure, have heard of the word organic before, probably at the grocery store or when you're shopping for food. So in the grocery store, the word organic usually refers to vegetables being grown without any chemical pesticides or chemical fertilizers being applied to them. Or you're talking about a meat product that hasn't had any extra chemicals put to it. Well, that use of the word organic is actually not correct. Basically, somebody took a word for a marketing campaign and misused it. All the word organic really and truly means is that something contains carbon. Any molecule that contains carbon, except for carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, is considered organic. So carbon-containing compounds have very, very specific behaviors and will do things in a predictable manner because of their chemistry. Carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, they don't follow the same rules and patterns that everything else containing carbon actually has, which is why they are not considered to be organic. Anything that does not contain carbon, no carbon whatsoever, and our two exceptions, they are what are called inorganic. So talking about organic fruits and organic vegetables, it's redundant. Fruits and vegetables have sugar in them, and sugar has carbon in it. Therefore, the fruits and vegetables are organic anyway. So our carbon compounds are special because carbon, remember, can form 4 covalent bonds. So we've got that carbon atom that has 6 electrons total, 4 in its outside shell. And so in order to fill up that outside shell, it has to make 4 covalent bonds. It's not going to give up its electrons. It's not going to take full responsibility for any electrons. It just wants to share them. And because it's got to share 4, it allows for carbon to form a lot of different compounds. Many of these compounds have what are called functional groups on them. Functional groups are clusters of atoms that influence the properties or control the properties of different molecules. They make molecules behave differently because of that grouping of molecules. They tend to be structural building blocks, so they're used to put together molecules in specific ways. One example is one that we've already kind of seen a little bit, and it's a hydroxyl group. So remember when we were talking about water, we talked about the fact that water breaks down into our hydrogen ions, which plays a role in our pH, but also makes that OH group that we were talking about before. That OH group that we're talking about right here, this group, is a hydroxyl group. Anytime we put a hydroxyl group onto something, it turns that molecule into an alcohol. So the OH gets attached onto a carbon, and we make it into an alcohol. And this OH group that we have here makes the alcohols be polar, and because they're polar, they can then dissolve in water. And we saw that when we did our penny lab, where when we put the drop of alcohol in with the water, the two mixed together, and you couldn't tell them apart anymore. Some other functional groups that we're going to talk about this year in a little bit more detail later on is what's called a PO4 group. This is a phosphate group. We'll talk about these when we talk about ATP, which is used for energy for cells. When we talk about DNA molecules, they have phosphate groups on them. So phosphate groups are a big group that we deal with a lot in biology. Another one is a COOH. This is a carboxyl group. Okay. This is going to be important when we talk about proteins. And another one is an NH3 group. This is an amino group. Again, this will be important when we talk about proteins as well. So here's an image of a whole bunch of different functional groups. So the ones that we're going to be talking about throughout the year that will show up over and over and over again is this carboxyl group that I mentioned, and the amino group, and the phosphate group. These are the ones that are going to show up repeatedly. Some of the others we'll talk about a little bit here and there, but those are the 3 that you really need to be aware of. So our macromolecules, or big molecules that are important for functioning of cells, they're made up of building blocks that are called monomers. So a monomer is a single building block, okay? So one of the things that I usually refer to when we're talking about these is think of Legos. An individual Lego piece would be a monomer, and then I can link those monomers, those Lego pieces together to build a polymer. And I can make a really, really big polymer called a macromolecule. So polymers are multiple monomers linked together. Okay? So one way to think about this is our individual monomer, our individual Lego. We got one Lego piece. I can take a whole bunch of Legos and put them together to make a mansion. I could build a colonial. I could build a log cabin with them. I could build the Eiffel Tower out of them. I could build all kinds of different things with them. I have different monomers. I have different shapes of Legos and different types of Legos. And I can put them together in different ways to make different polymers. So I can take the same different types, the same group of Legos, and have all one set of monomers that all have the same individual building blocks. And depending on how I attach those Legos together, I can make different looking houses with them. And so those are different polymers that are going to do different things. So for living things, the simple units that are the building blocks are called monomers, and then we put them together to make polymers. Eventually, we're going to put all those polymers together, and we're going to make something that's actually alive in the terms of a cell. But these monomers and polymers, they're just molecules. They are not alive. Okay, so now the next question becomes, well, how do I take a whole bunch of monomers and put them together? The chemical reaction is what's called a condensation reaction or a dehydration synthesis. So let's think about this for a second. What does the word dehydrate mean? Take a second, type that into the Edpuzzle. Okay, so dehydrate, usually when you're dehydrated, you're lacking water, right? Synthesis, what does synthesis mean? When you synthesize something, you put two things together. So synthesis means to put together. So put together. And dehydration, remember, means to remove the water. So what we end up doing here is taking water out in order to put two things together. So I've got an OH over here, and then I've got an H over here, right? So H and OH together make water molecules. So when I take off my H from one side, my OH from the other, I get my water. And now I've got this little bond right here and this little bond right here. Both these atoms need to form a bond. And so what they can actually do is now attach to each other. Okay, so just to make sure we're all on the same page, I've got a hydrogen and an oxygen with a hydrogen. I take the hydrogen off of this one, and I take the OH off of here, and I'm going to join my H and my OH to make water. Now this little nitrogen and this little carbon both need to form bonds. They are going to join together to make this bond right here that you see and link together these two molecules. So up top here, I've got this one here. This is still the same. It's still that same molecule I started with. I got this one over here. That's now this side. The only thing that's different now is that I'm short my water molecule that I took off. And so what I've done is I've taken these two molecules, molecule 1, molecule 2, and I've put them together and formed a bond between them by removing water from them. Okay? Hydrolysis is the opposite of this process. So hydro means water. Okay, so hydro is water. Lysis means to break. Anytime we see the word lyse or lysis, we're going to break something. So in this case, what we're doing is we're breaking our molecules by adding water back in. And so what we're actually doing is reversing our dehydration synthesis. Everything we talked about on the last slide, we're going to do the opposite of it here. Okay, one more molecule to talk about and thing to talk about for tonight. And then our next set of notes, we'll start talking about specific types of molecules. But ATP ATP is a three-letter acronym that is going to become your best friend. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So when I look at my picture here, I've got three different molecules. I've got adenine right here and ribose. Collectively, these two together make up adenosine. Okay. So ribose and adenine together are adenosine. And then if you notice, I have three phosphate groups. What's the prefix that means three? That's right, tri. And so the reason we call this adenosine triphosphate is this molecule, this adenosine, is linked to 1, 2, 3 phosphate molecules. ATP is an extremely high energy molecule. And it's because of these three little bonds holding my phosphates together. I can actually come in and snip this bond and release this phosphate off the end. And when I do that, I'm going to release energy. And the cell can actually use that energy to do something, to drive some kind of a chemical reaction. And then I can actually come along. So if I do this, I take ATP. I can break ATP down into ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, plus a phosphate, plus energy. And then I can actually break this down again into AMP, plus 2 phosphates, plus even more energy. So I can take off not one of these little phosphates, I can take off this one, and I can take off this one. I cannot chop that off. That has to stay, because if I take this one off, this carbon is short a bond, so it can't come off. This ATP molecule we're talking about that's used for energy, it's formed from breaking down glucose or sugar during a process called respiration. And we're going to talk about respiration in a lot more detail later in the year. I promise. Okay, so as always, write down the questions that you have, and then when we talk about this in class, ask your questions. Have a good night.